Hello, fellow cyborgs, and welcome to another 0 by 19 update. So this is where I tell you about all the books I've recently read, all of the books that I've recently hauled, the status of my physical TBR, and the things that I am currently reading or will be reading soon. These last few weeks have been okay for reading, but good for book buying. Sarai from Sarai Talks Books came and visited me over the weekend, and so that was a perfect excuse to go book shopping and try out some of the used bookstores that are relatively local to me, but nothing like down the street. So things happened and books were acquired. But first, let me tell you about the books that I have already read. In order of least favorite to the most enjoyable book of the read, we'll start off with The Madness Underneath by Maureen Johnson. This is the second book in the Shades of London series, of which I will not be continuing. The first book was about these mysterious murders being committed that are very reminiscent of the Jack the Ripper murders. Rory, a teenager from Louisiana, miraculously gets involved in this murder mystery in London because she's now in London because it's cool to put cool people from cool places in other cool places. And somehow she gets involved in this murder mystery that ends up having ghosts at its core. Book 2 was all about undoing the unnecessary decision of Rory having to leave London. So the first 2/5 of the book is getting her exactly where she left off before she was forced to move to Bristol. And then the rest of the book doesn't know what it's doing. There are so many subplots. There's no one true plot. This book just kind of derps around. There are 3 huge cliffhangers in this book that are just extremely unsatisfying. There are also 2 romantic interests in this book, and there was no emotion behind it. It felt like there has to be kissing because there has to be kissing in a YA book, not this serves a purpose for the character or for the plot. I was very, very unimpressed, and M.A. Anders, who I read this with, it was buddy read with M.A. Anders, she and I both were super disappointed and just kind of had a WTF face the whole way through, and by the end it was poopy. So I do not recommend, really disappointing, and like I said, will not be continuing on to book 3. So this is Grace by Natasha Dion, which I DNF'd at page 171, and I gave a 2-star DNF. I went into this with too high of expectations. I also read this directly after reading Beloved, which was not the best idea on my part, to be fair. However, I think that just because you've read a great book, that doesn't necessarily mean that every book you're going to read after it is going to be disappointing. I think that Grace was going to disappoint me no matter when or where I read it. So the premise of Grace is that it is a slave narrative where the book is narrated by a ghost. And so you get to hear her backstory and how she came to be killed, which is the first scene in the book. And then it also follows her daughter. So she's following her daughter and seeing what happens in her daughter's life. I found that the dual narrative was fine, but you don't need a ghost to do that. And at page 171, there was nothing special that having a ghost in the story had created. And I found that that was just a real missed opportunity in here, because if ever there's going to be a book with a ghost in it, then it needs to be special because of that ghost, in my opinion. I also felt like this book was just kind of ticking off the sorts of horrible things that can happen, that have happened to slaves, just for the sake of a slave narrative has to have this, a slave narrative has to have this. I didn't feel connected with the characters. I wasn't compelled by whatever sort of little mystery or discovering people's pasts that was in here. I'm very disappointed because I was sure that I was going to love this, but alas, I did not want to push forward after 171 pages, so nopers. This 2-star I finished, however. This is Difficult Women by Roxane Gay, and my main issue with this is twofold. That I want to say most, if not all, of these stories felt like the same story to me. They were exploring the same themes with the same sort of characters in the same sort of way. And I also was really annoyed and also bored that every single story had to have a sex scene in it. Even if it was thrown in at the end, even if it was a rape scene, there had to be a sex scene in all of these stories. I know that sex is a part of life, and I know that I'm a little bit of a prude, but it's like someone writing stories and constantly needing to talk about people chewing, or constantly, like, every story needs to have a scene where someone goes to the bathroom. You know, it's like these are things that are part of life, but that doesn't mean we need to fixate on it. I understand that perhaps Roxane Gay was trying to explore dealing with some of the shit that's happened in her life through these stories, but it was just, like I said, the stories felt so similar, so I didn't understand it, and it just wasn't my favorite. So yeah, this was a bit of a bust. I have not given up on Roxane Gay, but this was not a great introduction to her, in my opinion. This is Bloodline by Claudia Gray, which is a canonical Star Wars novel. I buddy read this with Sarai from Sarai Talks Books, and we both didn't like it, really. I gave this 2 stars as well. We're still in the 2-star territory. My main issue with this is this book had like 3 subplots that were very different sorts of stories and were all smushed together and so unsatisfactorily dealt with. I didn't understand why Ransom Casterfo and Leia's relationship had to be so awkward and flirtatious. Even though they were totally not flirting, it just felt like the beats in their relationship and the development of their relationship felt so much like a romance novel that it was creepy. I really wanted to hear more about Leia dealing with her heritage and the fact that she is the daughter of Darth Vader, but this is a relatively minor issue that it has very little psychological depth as far as the meat of this story. It's really not given its time. There's also a subplot of how the First Order is developed, but that is not adequately dealt with either. And the events in this book are supposed to take place 5 years before the events in The Force Awakens. And this felt very much like Disney or Lucasfilm was like, you know what, we need a book to bridge the gap between The Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens, and we're going to make this that book. And because that was like the sole purpose, the story in here suffered because this was like a placeholder and not I have a good story to tell. So yeah, I started out really enjoying this because I always enjoy being in the Star Wars world, but it really fell short for me and I was not satisfied with the ending, unfortunately. So very soon after my last video I finished We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. This I ended up giving 3 out of 5 stars, and this I buddy read with Acacia Ives, which was so helpful because upon finishing this, Acacia and I had a really in-depth discussion about this book, and I realized that I had completely framed it incorrectly going in. I had been spoiled about some of the basic events in this book by reading Shirley Jackson's biography, Shirley Jackson: A Haunted Life by Ruth Wilson something. I'll have it linked down below. So I knew the basic events of this. So I thought I knew what the story was going to explore, but that's not what it did. This is about Mary Cat and Constance and their uncle, and they're living in a house and they're ostracized from the villagers in the town that they live in. They're a wealthy family of the town, but also Constance was accused of murdering her entire family with the exception of their uncle and Mary Cat, but was acquitted. And so now they have that hanging over their heads. Mary Cat is a really odd person. She is very immature in how she looks at the world, and she, like I said, she's just very odd. One of the opening lines is talking about, Mary Cat says that like she could have been a werewolf because her like second finger is longer than her first finger or something like that. So she's just very quirky and odd. And that's what I thought. I thought that she was otherwise like a normal person, but maybe she's had some psychological blowback from the death of most of her family. But it turns out, and I recommend that you read this, as Mary Cat, she is mentally ill. Like there's not that she is dealing with the aftermath of the murder of most of her family. She was this way before that event, and this is how she's always been. And thinking about Mary Cat as someone who's mentally ill, this becomes just so much more awesome of a story, because the fact that Shirley Jackson wanted to write a story from the perspective of someone who was mentally ill, but not presenting her as mentally ill overtly, it just completely changes how I viewed all of the dynamics within this story. It was pretty intense. There was a lot of animosity within this text, not as much whimsy as I was anticipating, but very ambiguous and such a fun book to buddy read. I think Shirley Jackson is a really great author to buddy read because she's so concise and leaves so many things up to the reader's interpretation that it's really fun hashing it out with a buddy and saying, like, did you think this was what happened, or that this was what happened? And they'll say, I think it was this. And you're like, I didn't even think of that. She's really great to buddy read. So upon rereading, I think this will get a higher rating, but my initial experience before talking with Acacia was a little bit disappointed after The Haunting of Hill House, which is still my preferred Jackson. I also buddy read Beloved by Toni Morrison with Acacia Ives, and I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars, but I think that through most of my reading experience, I enjoyed it at more of a 3-star level. This story is about Setha and her family. She is an escaped slave, and we also, as the book progresses, learn about her life when she was still a slave on the plantation called Sweet Home. This is also a ghost story. Setha's daughter, Beloved, who didn't really have a name when she died, and she died when she was very young, is haunting the house that Setha is currently residing in, and then later that haunting escalates. This is part of a loose trilogy that Morrison wrote containing Beloved, Jazz, and Paradise, which are all like historical fiction novels exploring the historical lives of, I don't think they're necessarily based on real people, but it's based on real historical events. She's exploring African American history through this trilogy. Beloved is based on a true event, but telling you what that true event is spoils the big shebang twist of this book. I knew that twist going in, but I don't want you to know going in. This is a story about trauma and can we ever get over our traumas. This is a story about guilt. This is a story about blame. This is a story about the really grotesque things that happen to slaves. This is a story about, is a kind plantation owner, slave owner, a better person than a ruthless plantation owner, slave owner? Are degrees of slavery better than other degrees of slavery? And it's also just about family and figuring out what family means to you and the extent you'll go to for your family. One of the things that I didn't really understand centers around the ghost Beloved. I felt that was kind of too ambiguous for me. I wanted to learn more, but Toni Morrison wasn't interested in giving me more concrete idea of what was going on there. Overall, though, I think this was a much stronger novel than Tar Baby, which I read earlier this year by Morrison, but still does not beat my enjoyment of Song of Solomon. I'm looking forward to continuing in this trilogy. I think Jazz hopefully will be the next Morrison I pick up, if not The Bluest Eye. So Morrison is definitely still high up on my list of authors I enjoy, and I'm really glad that I finally got to this. I also read The Alienist by Caleb Carr, though I ended up listening to this on audiobook, and it's been one of my favorite audiobooks in quite a long time. My edition was narrated by George Goodell, I think, or Goodell, something like that. I'll make sure to have that linked down below as well. So The Alienist takes place in the late 1800s in New York, and in essence it's about the infancy of criminal profiling and how it can be used to solve crimes. So this follows Dr. Chrysler, John Moore, and Sarah, whose last name I do not remember, and they are the main trio that are investigating these child prostitute murders. The book is pretty dark and graphic. It explores child prostitution, and it also is very graphic about the mutilations that these bodies endured at the hands of the serial killer. So if you have a squeamish stomach or that just sounds not great to you, then don't read it. I will probably never watch the TV adaptation because of that. But I just really, really enjoyed the narration, and I also really enjoyed how this story had just like a nice steady pace. It wasn't too sensationalist when a lot of times these gory murders, and especially like in historical settings, the drama can just be on like overkill, because why not make it dramatic? But I just really liked this. It was just really solid and I really enjoyed it. I really want to listen to the next audiobook, but I'm holding off because I want to read a few things from my physical TBR on audiobook first. So anyway, that's The Alienist by Caleb Carr. I did not think that I would enjoy it as much as I did, but I really did. My favorite selection of the last few weeks is The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. I buddy read this with Sarai from Sarai Talks Books as well. Many buddy reads these last few weeks. So The Martian Chronicles was an interesting sort of thing, because a lot of these stories were originally published before The Martian Chronicles. Bradbury was having a hard time getting a book published, a book of short stories published, because not a lot of people read short stories. So what he did was he gathered together short stories that he'd written about Mars, edited them if needed, linked them together with these kind of flash fiction passages, and called it The Martian Chronicles, and sold it as more of a novel. When this really is a short story collection, I haven't read The Illustrated Man, but from what Sarai's told me of The Illustrated Man, it's a collection of short stories that is linked together by one main theme. So this is like The Illustrated Man. There were definitely some stories in here that were much stronger than other stories. Most of the flash fiction pieces didn't really work for me. They were just kind of like introductory paragraphs to a theme that would be coming up in the next story. But I just love Ray Bradbury's writing style, and I just feel cozy and comforted every time I read a Ray Bradbury. So for me, Bradbury is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and I will always just have this like blossoming feeling when I read Ray Bradbury. Some of my favorites in this collection included And the Moon Be Still as Bright, The Musicians, Usher 2, The Martian, There Will Come Soft Rains, and The Million Year Picnic. Those are just a few. There were a couple more that I really enjoyed as well. So yeah, The Martian Chronicles. I've been told that it's been on a list of like unsatisfying endings in books, but I just really enjoyed this, and I don't know why you wouldn't want to read it. It's pretty darn great. At the moment, my physical TBR shelf is at 81 books, which I'm pretty pleased about, though I wish it was in the 70s, but it will hopefully be in the 70s soon. But the problem is that I bought more books. I ended up buying 7 books since I last spoke with you. I'm a little bit disappointed in myself and my self-control, but it's not the end of the world, so let me go ahead and tell you the things that I just couldn't wait to pick up. I have been recently getting into, and by recently getting into, I mean I am totally a hardcore fan now, Star Trek The Next Generation. And when I learned that Kais Johnson, one of my favorite modern authors, wrote a Star Wars Next Generation book, I just like geeked out on the inside so hard. And when I made an order from Powell's and they had this for $3 in like, it's an amazing condition, I needed it. So this is Dragon's Honor by Kais Johnson and Greg Cox, and I am going to be reading this very, very soon. I am so incredibly excited for this. It is going to, I hope, just fill my geek heart with joy. Speaking of geek heart, this is Down Below Station by C.J. Cherryh. C.J. Cherryh is one of my favorite science fiction writers, even though I have not read nearly enough from her. This has been on my to-read list since Sword and Laser read it in December of like 2015 or something. And when I saw this really awesome, pretty trade paperback copy at a used bookstore, I had no excuses not to pick it up. So hopefully I'll be reading this soon as well. At that same bookstore, I also found this really awesome little hardback of Clay's Ark by Octavia E. Butler. This is technically number 3 of the Pattern Master series, but it seems like the Pattern Master series is kind of like thematically linked, but not like actually serialized. Not 100% though. I plan on reading this with Acacia soon because she loves the Butler, and this seems to be a little bit like post-apocalyptic crash landing of a spaceship and then like zombies or something. There's like some wasting, some sickness or something. So we'll see, but it's Octavia Butler, so I was going to give this groovy copy a try. I also found this really amazing copy of My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier. Sarai was there with me when we were looking at the shelves, and she said that she enjoyed this more than Rebecca. And since my last foray into du Maurier with Scapegoat was a dud, I'm hoping that My Cousin Rachel, which is a tried and true du Maurier classic, would help kind of reinvigorate my desire to read more du Maurier. I love this cover so much. So freaking much, and I just couldn't leave it behind, so there you go, got another du Maurier on my shelves. As you may know, I am planning on joining Becky M in Stephen King Reading Month in August. I put a couple Stephen King books on my wish list for family members, but then decided that they probably would fail me and not buy me the books I really wanted, and I just couldn't hold my horses, so I bought 2 more Stephen King books, because what's a readathon with just one book, right? I already have Salem's Lot, but apparently it's not enough. I picked up Joyland by Stephen King upon Becky M's recommendation. This is supposed to be good if you're not sure if you want to read the horrific Stephen King, but you want to try Stephen King. Nostalgia, carnivals, a serial killer, a ghost. I'll give it a try. I also picked up Different Seasons. These is 4 novellas, including Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption, which was the inspiration for The Shawshank Redemption, the movie, and The Body, which was the inspiration for Stand By Me, the movie. I definitely want to read this collection before I give up on King, if I do need to give up on King, so I decided to pick it up and read it in August. The last book is kind of a funny story, and I want to share it with you, even though it'll add minutes into this already loquacious video. So this is The Crossing by Cormac McCarthy. Sarai and I were in a Friends of the Library bookstore in a San Diego library. The person who was working there came up to me and said, "What can I help you find?" And I said, "Oh, I'm just browsing." She's like, "Well, what do I need to be reading then? Like, recommend something to me." And of course my mind went blank. And then I said, "John Steinbeck." And her response was, "Well, have you read Cormac McCarthy?" And I said, "No, I haven't read it." And she's like, "Not sure if it'll be too dark for you, but we have The Crossing, and Cormac McCarthy has a similar writing style to Steinbeck, and I think you would really like it." And so she kind of pitched it a little bit more to me and Sarai and said, "One of you needs to buy it because it's really good. It's the second in the trilogy, but it's okay. You don't need to read the first one to read this one." And so Sarai and I kind of just nodded our heads, but left without this. And we were derping around in the lobby before leaving, and she walks up behind us and she's like, "Here, I bought this for you because you both need to read it." And she just handed it to us. So because it's a little bit more battered than Sarai likes her book, so I don't really mind, The Crossing is now in my possession, and Sarai and I are planning on her reading All the Pretty Horses, which is the first in the trilogy, and me reading this one and talking about our experiences reading those 2 separate books in this trilogy. So yeah, weird, but hopefully she's right and it was a good idea that she thrust it into my hands. Whew, you guys are still here? Well, that's awesome. Let me tell you about the 2 books that I am currently reading. 10,000 Light Years from Home by James Tiptree Jr. is a short story collection, a sci-fi short story collection. I have read the first 3 or 4 stories in here. They're kind of weird. Alien sex has been a thing in at least 2 of the stories, so I'm not sure how I'm feeling about this, but I'm going to keep plodding along. Been trying to read a short story a day. I've missed out the last few days, but hopefully I'll get on this today. And I'm about halfway through Dracula by Bram Stoker. 2 weeks ago, I read 200 pages in 2 days and then haven't had the opportunity to pick this up since, but this weekend I'm hoping to get huge chunks read and hopefully even finished. I'm really enjoying this, even though gender roles and misogyny and machismo. So yeah, I'm going to be reading that as well, or continuing. Like I said, I've gone pretty far. So that's it, everybody. Please let me know in the comments down below, have you had some sort of weird book buying, book acquiring experience like I had with The Crossing? Because it was strange and I really hope that it pays off. Let me know what your favorite book you've recently read has been, because I'd love to catch up with you a little bit in the comment section. Wish me luck on getting my TBR down below the 80 mark and having it stay there, fingers crossed. And until next time, continue to be lovely.